All right, Aaron. So we're going to continue our conversation from a couple of days ago, which was a fascinating conversation. We were talking about Nietzsche and Zarathustra, and where we left off, we were talking about René Girard. Girard wrote an article called Dionysius versus the Crucified, where he kind of opposes Nietzsche's take, basically. And so if any of the listeners are interested, they can go to that video. It's right at the end, like the last few minutes, and you read a quote from that, which I think is important. And that contrasts Dionysus versus what the crucified represents as being two different ways of, let's say, interpreting or relating to the suffering of life. And so, at least in Nietzsche's idea, Christ represents suffering as, what would he say, a indictment
Condemnation.
against life? What is
Yeah.
that? Yeah,
I said a condemnation of life.
condemnation. Yeah, exactly. Whereas Nietzsche himself wants to see suffering as being essentially part of life and therefore something that is that can be affirmed in itself. This is what he thinks of as being the Dionysian way of being. So in that article, Girard talks about, he has, of course, a whole theory around scapegoating being necessary to form and maintain human societies. And he thinks that Nietzsche kind of understood this, in that he's, in contrasting the two ideals, he's sort of directly supporting, sort of consciously supporting the ideal of victimization, scapegoating. That's kind of what he argues in the article. So
Yeah.
I took exception to that, I think. And so I posed a question to you. So I'll just repeat it in a concise form. Basically, my question is this, because it seems to me that what Nietzsche's actually doing is he's talking more in a more basic way than just about society. He's talking on an ontological level. He's talking about chaos, violence, and suffering being constitutive of existence. He's not talking primarily about the societal level. And so my question to you was, let's say that everyone becomes a perfect Christian, Christianity as understood as preached by Jesus on the Sermon of the Mount, complete nonviolence, turning the other cheek, love for one's enemies. What then? Because does the physical world change? Does
Hmm.
existence change? It seems to me we're still left with the fundamental problem, which is what Nietzsche is looking at. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think this obviously a really good question. So I do want to complicate it a bit before I answer, and then I'll give you, like, let's say, the option to reformulate if you like, or otherwise I'll respond to the same thing, but it might be like a little bit more boring answer after your current formulation, let's say, or after my complication of it, which is that Girard, at the end of his life, in his last works, he became quite apocalyptic on really what this Christian revolution brought about. So basically, he also agrees with Nietzsche that it has brought about a problem of sorts, which is the problem of resentment. It's just uh, it's a problem that seems to have been created by Christianity in some ways, but that's precisely because it solves another problem, which is sacrificing innocent victims.
Mhm.
And I think that's important to keep in mind, because I don't think Girard is so like easy, like, okay, like now we need to go all the way Christian, because we can see that Christianity is obviously just amazing without its faults. And then what happened previously was good, because, like, as you also mentioned, like, it seems fairly necessary. And that's, by the way, that's another complication that I would add. Nietzsche, I'm not sure if Girard quotes it in that text, but there's a specific quote by Nietzsche, which I may have also used for my thesis, where he says, like, a society needs sacrifice, it needs victims. So he also makes this claim that,
Mhm.
oh yeah, yeah, like, I think he specifically says, but I can look it up if you like. Um, uh, what Christianity tried to do is get rid of sacrifices, basically. But society precisely needs sacrifice in order to flourish. That's more or less like a quote that is directly from Nietzsche, which is also like one that obviously Girard points to, saying like, look, basically what I'm saying is already in Nietzsche. I just reach different conclusions as to what to do about it than he does. So one complication would be indeed, I don't think it's true that it's necessarily just for the individual. Like it does seem like he talks about society as well. But I agree, and that's I think maybe we can circle back to the Lampert point in a little bit, that to a large extent, just like with the eternal recurrence of the same, like it seems like he's not describing something out there. He's always tying it to like, let's say, this psychological motivation, just like he does with all of his writing. So it's definitely not like he's exclusively describing a societal thing. But the other thing I would say, like obviously, like I I'm also not necessarily vouching for all of us should become Christian, because like then you get all these difficult theological questions on universalism. Like is actually like, okay, the goal is that all of the world should be Christian, or is there always this sense of, for instance, Pajot speaks about, the center and the margin, and that you never want, like complete like a monotone Christianity, but you always want to keep the margins as the margins in some sense. So I have all these questions regarding your question before I can answer it. So I'm curious what you think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that complicates it a bit. But I don't know if it, like, I guess, fundamentally changes it. I guess, maybe I'll just sort of talk out loud for a little bit and see if that kind of gets at the point. So it seems to me that and this is a very tentative view, I guess, but it seems to me that the Christian ethic, like the hardcore Christian ethic of the Sermon of the Mount, can't be a universal ethic, and it has to be nested within the conditions of earthly existence. So
Can you
that's
help to connect to like so it can't be a universal ethic, and it has to be tied to, so it both can't be a universal ethic, but it also has to be tied to earthly existence. So like how do those relate to each other?
so it can be applied in limited circumstances or in limited places.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like
Okay,
how
okay.
it's, yeah.
I see, yeah.
So how it's commonly been applied in historical Christianity, of course, as a private ethic.
Mhm.
Christian nations going to war with each other, but a general sense within those Christian nations that if all things considered, you should forgive your enemies, that kind of thing. So obviously that's a very watered down version of it. But it relates to something Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morals about justice. Like justice is not something that can be universalized in the sense of applied to existence itself. It can only be applied within societies or groups, or, you could say there's a certain justice within one's body. Basically, units of power can have an internal justice, but the idea of justice between all things doesn't make sense just because of the way that nature is, namely that nature is strife. Now, this is why I posed the question, because if that Christian ethic can never be unconditionally and universally applied, it seems that let's not call it ethic, but reality that Nietzsche points to, that is to say the strife and violence of life, is more fundamental. And so an orientation or an orientation to being that is in accord with that is going to be more fundamentally, what would you say, significant, true, maybe in a certain sense, than the Christian one.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So that's kind of what I'm getting on. I'm sort of suggesting that it seems that Nietzsche's Dionysian ideal is true to existence in a way that the Christian ideal isn't. And so, we don't have to focus specifically on scapegoating in societies. It could be that societies are maintained by scapegoating.
Yeah.
I haven't read Girard's books, so I don't know the evidence. It might be that they're not. It might be that it's just a occasional thing that happens in some societies. But more importantly, all beings, like all physical beings, you know, require predation of some kind, require displacing other beings. That seems more fundamental to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Um, yeah, I think one reason why we could, let's say, applaud Nietzsche's attempt at bringing back the Dionysian is precisely because he's trying to do so like consciously, and that's difficult. Like that's an extremely difficult task because like obviously if you think about it, then let's say before there wasn't like a conscious Dionysianism. It's like, oh, like I'm considering all the different gods, but I see what Plato is doing, like it's leading up to Christianity. So instead I'm just gonna maybe worship Dionysus. That's more or less like that's not something that used to happen. So it's like Nietzsche is taking it upon himself to consciously work through the meaning, as we looked at the quote by him that Girard also quotes, of the martyrdom of Dionysus. And say like consciously I've worked out why it is truer to life in all the ways that you point out. I would to some extent object a little bit to what you say this is closer to nature. I think it's closer to, let's say, a certain type of understanding and living in nature that is also valid, but has been complicated by the Christian Revolution. And this is more or less, and by the way, Judeo-Christian Revolution. This is more or less something that Girard also points to. It's like now when like let's say if we go back like millennia and we have like a whole society just brutally murdering like a smaller society, it's like it's not like people used to say like, well, how could they this is just like this is going against justice. And now if that would happen today, like you can look at all the major world conflicts, so the war in Ukraine, or those are the one happening in Gaza and Israel, like it's immediately viewed through that lens. And for me, it's very difficult to see how that could be different. Like how that could be different after this, let's say, revaluation of all values, to use Nietzsche's language, has entered the scene. And I think this is like the really most important point, that there's this way of viewing the world that has entered that has now become relevant. And I think what I've tried to argue a little bit in my thesis as well is to say like is that Nietzsche says, well, we need to be careful because by itself, like it will weaken. It needs to be challenged very, very strongly. But I'm gonna try to make it a little bit more intuitive and apply it to the individual to say like close to nature. And this is actually an example that I think Pajot uses, that he says like, okay, basically if you have a family situation, that family situation could function very well, and this would be like, let's say, in accord with the Nietzscheanism, by having maybe one of the family members who you all scapegoat, who's just like all like, oh, it's always, that fucking guy, that brother who keeps messing up. And like, right? And that will like bind you, it will connect you. But at the same time, obviously it does mean more or less to be angry with each other, because you can all celebrate your anger by projecting it onto this one individual. And at the same time, he says like, yes, well, what could also be the case is that you work on an ethic of self-sacrifice. And that would be like, well, no, I'm actually not sure if it's his fault. Maybe it was me. Like I can't see it yet, but I actually think that maybe I should have handled things differently. And that's on the one hand extremely dangerous, because if you do that, you invite yourself, just like Jesus did, like Christ did, to become the scapegoat, to all of a sudden be like, oh, well, maybe it is you, and then all of a sudden like they'll all go against you. But at the same time, you might inspire, and that's indeed like to respond to your point, like in small societies, you might inspire like a truly loving connection where no one is scapegoated all the time, and everyone, and that's the let's say the negative part of that will be resentment, but everyone is focused a little bit more inward on, okay, no, how can I actually show up to sacrifice myself as opposed to sacrificing another individual, let's say in this environment. And I don't see how that's precisely against nature itself. I do know, like, the quote that we referred to, which was like, like it's a condemnation of life because it thinks it's something that like that should be conquered, whereas, or like not no, death is something that should be conquered. I'm not sure if that's the right word. Whereas life or death is something for Dionysus that is like part of life and it's part of the whole cycle. So I do see that part, but I'm just curious if you could respond to, let's say, this small objection with a small
Yeah.
o.
Well, I wouldn't have anything really to say against it on because it's speaking on the level of society. And so what I'm suggesting is that Nietzsche's going deeper than a societal level when he's dealing with the issue of, let's say, Dionysus versus the crucified. And so, yes, self-sacrifices or can be good. It certainly can be better than scapegoating. We can kind of accept that. Obviously, Christianity as it actually exists, or has existed, has a little bit of an extra thing added on, which is that the nature as we know it is fallen and will be redeemed and transformed at the end of time. That's kind of what I'm hinting at here. I assume that Girard, being a more or less Orthodox Christian, also holds that view. But that is the thing that makes that's the whole thing that brings, I think, the Christian ideal together. The Christian ideal depends on this notion of the Last Judgment and, the resurrection of the dead. Otherwise, it becomes something that is more or less, frankly, life-denying. It becomes a kind of Schopenhauerianism. I remember reading Tolstoy, I think it was The Kingdom of Heaven, and he kind of brings up this objection that people make to his sort of radical non-violence and non-sexuality. If everyone applied this, wouldn't the human race just die out? And he's basically like, yeah, it would. Um, is that an objection? And so that to me is really interesting because it kind of suggests that Nietzsche's onto something when he calls Christianity a kind of nihilism. Christianity works by saying that nature is not the way that nature is now isn't how it truly is, and it won't be like that at the end of time. If you take out that metaphysical supposition, it feels like then you must be just left with a denial of nature. So while you could say that societies can be constituted by scapegoating, or they can be, let's say, constituted by a kind of higher, more conscious self-sacrifice, which certainly seems to be the case as well, even if it's maybe not as stable or effective. You don't have to be for literal scapegoating. I'm not sure that Nietzsche was. I don't see any evidence that he was. But you could take either view on that position and still have the fundamental problem of how do we relate to nature? How do we relate to being? And it seems to me the Dionysian view says yes to being as it is or as it appears to us. And Christianity says no as it appears to us. And then Orthodox Christianity says, but, there's a secret hidden version of it that's just waiting to be revealed, which is fair enough. Like, I'm not mocking that.
Yeah.
But it's just, if you don't have that presupposition, what do you do with that?
Yeah. I by the way, like I don't know Girard's own views on, like, and how he, like, I know he was a Catholic. Like, I'm not sure how he ties it to his own, like, understanding of Christianity. But I think it is fair, like, let's say, if you apply it more to you as an individual trying to live your life, what kind of life should you live? And it's precisely the recognition that we very much, again, live in a Dionysian world, you could argue, precisely like because of the 20th century and what happened there, that it's up to us to, at points, decide whether or not to take inspiration from, let's say, something that affirms it all, like for instance, I was listening, by the way, to this song. I had to perform for a wedding, and the lyrics go something like everything is hallelujah, and it's just to basically assert, like I think it starts off, I think it's by Gungor. It starts off saying like we look for love in the shiniest places, like, but life does not work that way, um, and we'll never learn to praise until we can grieve. And then he said, like, everything is hallelujah. So there's, I think, this notion. I don't think that's like a very rare understanding in Christianity to also say, like, it's actually something to affirm it all. And there's something about that which I find in Dionysius. And by the way, this might jump a little bit forward to, let's say, how I would do opponent processing, because like now it all feels mixed up as I'm responding to your question. But that would be like that, if you truly understand what you're doing, for instance, um, when you're partaking in communion, in the Holy Communion, it's like, you're drinking the blood
Mm.
of like a semi or like, of a divine human.
Mm-hmm.
And you're consuming his flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Like, try to like just like, we don't realize that, let's say, when we partake in that, we're just like, yeah, I mean, like, that's just what you do, you just partake in communion. But let's say you truly like realize what that would mean and how that could transform you, let's say, that's one way of bringing back in a little bit of the Dionysian in Christ himself, which is, by the way, a tradition that goes back like super long ago. Like, it feels radical. It's almost like if you would not find it so normal, it would sound pagan. Like, what? You
Yeah.
drink the blood and eat the body of that, like, but Christ introduced that himself. So I'm saying, like, I think there's ways of seeing that also, because it comes after that, it integrates some of these parts before. And then I think it's up to us to not necessarily say, like, this my fundamental orientation is to be Dionysian. It's like, well, actually, I think I see elements of Dionysus in Christ, and that's one of the reasons also why I argue in my thesis that Nietzsche, when he stumbles upon Jesus himself, he kind of sees like, I can't really continue my criticism here that I've laid at the feet of Christianity thus far. So when I'm responding to you, because like you're asking me to point it to the individual, but if I'm focused on the individual, then I'm thinking about someone like Jesus or a Dionysus or a Zarathustra or a Socrates or whatever, like I'm thinking about that type of life. But if I'm thinking about the societal, like, that's something that we shouldn't be doing, because I somewhat agree that societally, like, it seems weird, and that's also like, I guess the Tolstoy point, to say like, oh yeah, well, I'll be a Christian and I'll sacrifice myself, but only if you also all sacrifice themselves. Like, that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. So I'm still having difficulties answering this question just because of all these different branches. You know what I mean?
I mean, let me see. I guess what I'm suggesting is that Nietzsche's idea of the Dionysian gels with existence as we know it better than the Christian ideal of self-sacrifice, which isn't to deny the Christian ideal of self-sacrifice or say it has no place at all. But I guess this is somewhat linked to Nietzsche's idea of life as will to power, or beings as will to power, right? We do actually exist by consuming the energy of our surroundings. That's more fundamental than what we do with these bodies that we do have based on that energy consumption, which then can be peaceful, at least among other human beings and perhaps among animals as well, to a certain extent, but only ever to a certain extent. So because the Dionysian ideal gets to the heart of existence, arguably, unless we bring in this other thing, which is the general resurrection, it's therefore truer, it seems. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think it to some extent does make sense, but I think if you apply that, let's say, more universally, you also acknowledge that, it's not like you are will to power, it's like life is will to power. So that means that,
Yes.
yes, everything in me, like, everything in me, like let's say, consists of all these different drives that all want to dominate. Like
Yes.
he talks about virtues as well in Zarathustra that all want to dominate your being.
Yes.
But that's also an acknowledgement that you live in a world where there are all these external forces that also
Yes.
all want to dominate. So it's like if you it's not to say necessarily like I'm not sure if you then could argue that it gels better with life, because if you apply it consistently, you are also aware of the fact that, okay, like my conscious understanding of reality, knowing it to be larger than I am,
Hmm.
is very well aware that at some point I will need to be sacrificed to it.
Oh,
And that
yes.
could then
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's where the two ideals do come together, in the sense that Dionysus also, in a sense, sacrifices himself, or
yeah.
willingly accepts his sacrifice. That is
Yeah.
part of life. And so in that sense, they're the same. Um,
Mhm.
Nietzsche would
Also,
argue, though, that he's doing it, that for him, that sacrifice is a purely immanent thing. It doesn't get above and beyond life. It just
mhm.
affirms life as it is. Christ's
Yeah.
sacrifice, supposedly at least, um, somehow gets us above and beyond reality as we know it. It gets us to the resurrected body. So that's the that's the key difference. And so, I mean, this is in a way a very abstract
So
thing.
you basically mean,
Yeah.
um, because the resurrection, it's a rejection of death, because like as soon as we're sacrificed, it's like, well, then we die. But no, we don't want to die. We want to stay alive, and therefore we don't affirm the part of life that includes death. Is that?
Well, yeah. I mean, for Nietzsche, or at least if he's speaking metaphorically, there's a kind of rebirth, there's a kind of resurrection in the sense that life overcomes itself, reconstitutes itself with new forms. Um, but
Mhm.
the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of the general resurrection that points to is very different.
Mhm.
This is not, this is eternal life. This is perfect life. This isn't, you know, this isn't just reconstitution of life in the new generation. This is like permanent, individual, blessed life forever. I think that's what Nietzsche takes exception to, because um,
Mhm.
it's it's well, he would, I don't fully buy this, but he would say that it's just been invented to, condemn existence,
Yeah,
existence as it
yeah, yeah,
is. Yeah.
yeah. So like, I mean, obviously, like I'm aware of the, let's say, surface level Nietzsche criticism of Christianity. I'm just not sure if like, and maybe that's where I would like to circle back to the Lampert interpretation, but we can like not to leave this, because I think this is actually this might get to the core of the issue. So it's I don't want to reject it, but um, in that article that you
Hmm.
sent, where I think it's a speech by Lampert where he more or less summarizes, some of the most important facets of Nietzsche that he believes we should take seriously in the 21st century.
Hmm.
And the title is Taking Nietzsche at His Word in the
Hmm.
21st Century. And well, interestingly enough, like I already have like two issues with that I think somewhat relate to this. So like if we take him at his word, it depends on which words you focus on.
Yes.
So I noticed that Lampert focused on certain words by Nietzsche
Yes.
and takes a lot out of it and doesn't focus on other ones. So for instance, you notice in my thesis, I focus on different words. I focus on the Nietzsche that around the same time in letters says like, by the way, I want you to know that um, in my heart, I've never been mean to Christianity and I've always
Hmm.
struggled on behalf of its ideals. It's
Hmm.
like, okay, that's also his word. Why would we not take him at those words? So that would be one thing. But then the other thing is like, is it really the best way, especially to be consistent with Nietzsche's own philosophy on, like we're subject to the drives that want to dominate us. Um, to really say like that our words are something that we should take ourselves by. Like, isn't it like shouldn't we look at a far more complete picture of ourselves embedded in our relationships, our environment, our culture, the symbolisms, the symbols we use, the myths we refer to, and see how all of that together adds up this complex picture? Because to me, like the intentions, and that's maybe actually the Nietzscheanism in me, that I'm like,
Hmm.
I'm not so much interested in someone's intentions. Like a little bit, like obviously, like I want them to be to apply in the same way, but precisely Nietzsche argues that, oh yeah, people intend to be good, but really deep down they're resentful. And it's like, okay, so I have two issues with that. And therefore I want to see why this came to mind when we were just discussing the previous point. Uh, I want to know why I circled back to the Lampert interpretation precisely, because there was this one thing that you said that made me recall this very specifically. But I don't think it comes to mind that easily, unfortunately. But I would say, like, just in general, this notion that therefore, we could focus on this being, oh yeah, like being of central importance to Nietzsche. I'm like, well, it really depends. Like, I think this is a certain interpretation and it's fairly interesting, but I know it's a contested interpretation. I've now
Hmm.
had a little bit more time to look at some responses to Lampert, and I've
Hmm.
seen that many people appreciate it because like it's a definitive
Hmm.
interpretation. It seems almost of Zarathustra, but other analyses of Zarathustra say like, well, Lampert says this, but he cites no textual evidence for it. So it's more like an assertion that seems to fall in line with what he wants to argue for. And by the way, I think it's interesting. We could again circle back to it. But nonetheless, why I want to raise that is because to me, it's not so self-evident that when Nietzsche just talks about Dionysus, he's saying, well, like that's really the thing that's closest to what reality is all about, because then you have to discount so many other parts of him. For instance, like what I mentioned about um, the the poem specifically of Between Birds of Prey, where he really seems to dread
Hmm.
some of or coming to terms with some of these understandings of reality.
Hmm.
Um, and but like that's again me struggling, and part of my frustration at this very moment is that I just haven't worked it out. That I'm like, okay, like I want to give a fully fleshed like answer to some of these questions you were asking, but I'm also like, okay, I'm not quite satisfied with, let's say, your formulation of the answer, which is nothing against you, but specifically that I'm
Hmm.
like, yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but also not like, yeah, because of this. Like I don't know. I just know it's complex and it's probably going to require a little bit more work from my side. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, the title of his article, taking Nietzsche at his word. Wonder if there's a little bit of irony there, because what Lambert actually does is, of course, dig a little bit deeper than the surface of the text. So he's
Yeah,
trying to put it together. Um,
that too.
yeah. Did you have any other reflections on sort of Lampert's approach? Any specific things that you would sort of have a different interpretation of yourself?
Like I thought it was really interesting. Like I think we can like if we still have time today to discuss Heidegger, it's really interesting that he considers will to power to be like a fundamental ontology, which I mean you can take from Nietzsche. Like he literally like there's notes where he says like everything is will to power. So that really sounds like an ontological claim. So not necessarily against that, but it is interesting because other people say like, well, no, it's more like an ethical understanding of reality. And one thing like that I did have to admit, like I somewhat uh, had my doubts there is like the fourth point on ecology. Like I kind of understand the basic thing of staying true to the earth, but I'm always a little bit wary of people that try to, including myself, by the way, but like that try to say like, well, actually, Nietzsche really fits our time. Like it's
Yeah,
like kind of like,
yeah.
yeah, I mean like climate change is coming about, and actually we need Nietzsche because Nietzsche really cared about the earth. It's like, well, so what he seems to argue is that if you truly understand will to power, he says like so yeah. Celebrant of the open sky, Zarathustra holds an ontology of will to power that naturally harbors an ecological bias because it disallows the idea that we humans are somehow essentially different or separate from the natural world. And again, this is one of those understandings that ontologically seems to be true, but also it means like, okay, yes, but we are nonetheless beings in which we have drives that want to dominate. So Nietzsche himself,
Mm,
he seems like even though he seemed to have tried out the diet too, but he like ridicules vegetarians,
mm,
like like multiple times. And it's
mm,
like you wouldn't ridicule vegetarians if you would be like, well, actually, no, but we need to care about the animals because we're all like the same will to power. It's like, so I found that part of the analysis a little bit weak that I'm like, well, actually, yeah, but Nietzsche is also prone to acknowledge that, yes, okay, will to power, yes, it does mean some kind of harmony between everything, but at the same time still motivated from, okay, but that doesn't mean that I should, therefore, what do you call it, like live accordingly to that harmony, because in me is also the drive to will to power, so I should strive to be dominant in this environment too.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't really too sure about that. And other parts that I thought was interesting was like that he actually has fairly controversial understandings of Plato and Descartes, and which actually is something I really appreciate. I really like it when people go against the traditional readings of some of these authors. I'm not sure if I agree with it. I'm not sure if the evidence is there that secretly, Descartes was completely against Christianity, even though I know there are some like he was there were controversies between him and the Rosicrucians. But the same with like someone like Bacon. I've read some of these works that he's citing, so it was very interesting for me to read how he kind of sees like, okay, we have to re-understand philosophy and really see Nietzsche as a kind of Plato in some sense, which I thought was but also like very daring. That I'm like, wow, okay, I'm not sure like when I actually listened to your video on his interpretation of Zarathustra, sometimes I was actually kind of like, yeah, but this just sounds like how I would interpret Zarathustra. I think he's more or less going against, let's say, a more postmodern reading of Nietzsche, where he's all concerned about interpretations and the value of truth, and which is also in Nietzsche, by the way, so I understand that too. And he's like, no, but Zarathustra tells us about a way of living and about a way of life. But I'm kind of familiar with that understanding of Nietzsche, because to me, like the Nietzsche of existentialism is very important, not so much the Nietzsche of postmodernism, even though I understand that's also a very valid way of reading Nietzsche. So to me, I was kind of like, okay, to me, it doesn't seem that surprising. But when I was reading this article and saw it tied to Plato and Descartes and Bacon and some of these other parts, I was like, well, I'm not so sure now anymore about some of his interpretation. So I'm both very appreciative of Lampert, but also critical of some of his conclusions, and not too sure about some of his characterizations of other philosophers too. Um, is there anything in there you found interesting to
I
respond?
I would be inclined to agree with you, I think, about the ecology. Um, he argues that the eternal return is an ecological view, because you're willing the eternal return of things as they are. I can see a certain compellingness to that. But also, strictly speaking, if you look at it logically, you could will the eternal return of the things that have been and still want things to be different in the future. You could still, and also when you bring will to power into it, like you did, you as a being still want to dominate other beings. And so there is definitely a tension there. So
Yeah.
I wasn't fully on board with Lampert's ecology.
Mm,
Just leave everything as they are. Just put limits on
mm,
science, at least in terms of like technological science.
mm.
Um, okay, so I'm back with Aaron. The conversation got cut short, basically because I was not feeling very well. But I'm feeling much better. So this is a few days later, and we're going to finish it off today. So first thing I wanted to do was just continue the point that I was previously talking about, which was about ecology. So we kind of agreed that this is maybe where this is a bit of a weak point in Lampert's interpretation.
Mhm.
And I don't think that it's completely off base, but I think that the degree to which he emphasizes it maybe, or I think it's just a little bit more, what's the word? Nuanced than he suggests. I mean, so there's a couple of things I want to say about this. The first thing, though, I want to do is to respond to something that you said about, Nietzsche ridiculed vegetarians, and I think I've seen a couple of those things. I think he criticizes the entire Indian subcontinent for eating rice at one point, speculating what effects that might have on their philosophy and so forth. Um, But in any case, so I don't see vegetarianism and ecology as being particularly close together, really. I think that, and I think Lampert would agree. I think he was a bit of a hunter and an outdoorsman, and so I think that that's not so much an issue. I don't think that's where necessarily the divergence between Nietzsche and ecology would be, because um, recognizing that you're part of the part of nature is recognizing that you know, eat other animals. The key difference would be that you're not sort of doing that on a industrial factory farming scale, or you're not eliminating whole species. That would be the key thing. The
Yeah.
second, yeah, that would be the issue, I think. And so, but that I think that's good because it kind of shows where an ecology that is based in nature rather than ideals, where what that could look like. Because I think that if you're talking about something like veganism or something like that, often, not always, but often the motivation isn't something like ecology or being more natural, but is kind of like a very abstract ideal of cause no suffering to any being. So it's
Mm.
very sort of un-Nietzschean. Um, so the other thing that I wanted to say about it is in reference to Zarathustra. So another part of Zarathustra where I sort of thought, Lampert, you're onto something, but I feel like that there's more to it than this, was in the second dance song, um, where he remembers the whip, where Zarathustra remembers the whip and kind of uses it against life or uses it near life. Um,
Mhm.
he basically says to her, "You'll dance to the rhythm of my whip." And Lampert interprets that as being the emphasis is all on rhythm, and he interprets that as being the rhythm of eternal return. So we're not
Mm.
talking about like domination of nature. We're talking about something a bit more metaphysical. Um,
Mhm.
I think that's probably part of it. I think that the rhythm aspect is probably a meaningful aspect of it. But I would think that actually the the dominant and violent aspects of it are also important in that metaphor, and that this does accord well with Nietzsche's conception of beings as expressions of the will to power. And
Mhm.
so that's another place where I would see Lampert as maybe not going as far in that direction as Nietzsche would. But it's nuanced, and so I wouldn't agree with anyone who kind of takes a transhumanist approach to nature either, and sort of like completely dominate nature, change nature, transform nature completely. I don't think that he's saying that either. It's a funny, interesting in between state of be naturally like assertive and you know, this is what humans do, dominate your surroundings,
Mhm.
but have a deep respect for them at the same time.
Yeah.
So maybe that's an opponent processes thing of a different kind, right? Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree.
yeah.
I think, and it's also like if you look at, let's say, the the German original wording for the original recurrence of the same, like they don't, the same sounds like it's the exact same, but it's the like, it's the gleich. So it's like it's more like
Mm-hmm.
it's the likewise that I think is also relevant because it has that slight, let's
Mm.
say, nuance that allows for like, yes, actually I want to affirm everything that has been like it has been before, but at the same time, likewise could, as you know very well from your own life and as everyone knows, like likewise could be like, whoa, I kind of experienced this before, but it's completely
Mm-hmm.
different now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that relevant can, that aspect can also be relevant,
Mm-hmm.
to what you, yeah, nice.
Yeah. So we
Good.
we we don't have much dispute on that point, I think. I just wanted
No,
to
I don't think so.
kind of round
No.
that out.
Yeah, yeah. No, I more or less I think I agree with everything you said there. And I also think in terms of like, let's say the, like one question that I would have, but I'm not sure we should answer it. But in terms of like the factory farming,
Mm.
and by the way, that's just like me thinking philosophically. I don't support factory farming, but that one aspect which more or less saves Nietzsche from some of these, let's say, objections or counter arguments, or he's gotten from some people saying like, like Nietzsche's very dangerous, is like, well, Nietzsche's actually against resentment. And resentment often plays out, in our own motivation against other groups of people. So, for instance, what Nietzsche did in his own time, the anti-Semites against Jewish people. And it would be interesting to see to what extent there could like be like a resentment towards animals, or if that's like not playing part, like of this. So I think it's like a different category than going and killing like large groups of people, if that makes sense. Because I don't think like factory farming in itself is motivated by resentment of animals, but it is motivated nonetheless by it seems to be a lacking connection to reality, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
anyways, like I don't want to go too deeply into that, but I think it's something maybe thinking about. we're thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it raises some interesting questions. I don't necessarily see the resentment angle, but I do see the lack of sense of reality angle. There's a lack of reverence for life, and there's a lack of like recognition of these are really living beings. But we don't want to go too far into this topic. We'll get distracted. So let's
And one thing then, we should
yes.
obviously remember, let's say, the anecdote at the end of Nietzsche's life that maybe or maybe not was true, but him like seeing this horse being beaten on the
Mm,
street, and
hmm.
him embracing that horse because he
Yes.
was like, oh.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Exactly. I think that, I mean, there's probably a whole lot of discussion. I don't know if there is, but there's probably a whole lot of discussion of like Nietzsche and diet, or Nietzsche and like food
For
lifestyles
sure.
and so forth. Didn't he essentially have a carnivore diet? Or is that kind
For a
of
while.
for a
Yeah,
while?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct. At least that was also I think it was like, meat and only meat 4 times or 5 times a day.
Hmm.
Uh, but he has more or less experimented with everything due to his own health. So there were
Hmm.
also times of his life where he was consuming more or less a vegetarian diet, and it would also really depend on the place where he would be. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about Heidegger. I know very little about Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche and Zarathustra. Um, in Lampert's commentary, he does mention Heidegger, and he does mention his interpretation of some aspects, but I wouldn't have any confidence in my understanding of them. So tell me in a nutshell, or as close to a nutshell as you can, what is Heidegger's interpretation here?
Yeah, yeah. So specifically Zarathustra, like I know, like Heidegger is actually I think Nietzsche may be like the main character, let's say, in Heidegger's writing,
Hmm.
which is something that not like that many people know about, but he really writes a lot about Nietzsche, and
Hmm.
there's something interesting in his writing about Nietzsche that it also makes like a change at some point. So he is also one of those thinkers that really appreciates many aspects of Nietzsche, but then also sees like, okay, maybe it doesn't go far enough, or
Hmm.
in these aspects he goes a little bit too far. And I should also add a caveat, like for people either unfamiliar or familiar with precisely this, is like that Heidegger was involved in the National Socialist movement when he was in Germany, and he continued to, let's say, teach during that movement, while, let's say, all the Jewish professors and teachers obviously were more or less
Hmm.
banned or obligated or worse, like from the universities. And he later on stated that, like, he was teaching on Nietzsche at the time, that during those courses of Nietzsche, out of which I think a total of maybe 4 volumes of worth of books appeared, he said that he was already offering spiritual resistance against the Nazi regime. And like, to me, it sounds like a cop out. Like, so I'm not
Hmm.
going to defend it, but I'm saying like there's all these aspects
Hmm.
outside of his interpretation of Nietzsche that complicate his interpretation. But the basic point, which I think is very interesting, is um, I can actually explain fairly easily. He more or less says that Nietzsche, in some of his unpublished writings, he states that his own philosophy is an inverted Platonism, because everything becomes will to power. So like if you look at, let's say, the Nietzschean reading of Plato, you have like, reality, the eternal ideas, let's say at the top of the hierarchy. And then we have, let's say, the sensible world in which we live, and that's mere appearance. So you have, like, and that's, I think, very, like, there's some truth in that interpretation of Plato. We discussed it only a little bit. And what you see Nietzsche doing by proclaiming himself to like be an inverted Platonist, and he does that, I think at least once, but I think a couple of times in those notes. He kind of says like, what we want to do is actually we want to say that the earth is most important. Like the earth is at the top of the hierarchy, and then like at the bottom you have like those ideas and those eternal changing things. And that's why he characterized himself as an eternal as an inverted Platonist. And Heidegger's point, which I think is fairly apt, is like this doesn't profoundly change things. Like if you uh, invert certain statements, you're still to some extent under the influence of that statement or of that way of thinking. So if you invert Platonism, you're still a Platonist in some sense, which is why Heidegger actually calls Nietzsche the last metaphysician, which is a very strange thing to say. It has to do with Heidegger's polemical understanding of metaphysics as the forgetfulness of being. So basically, at the start of his life, Heidegger just equates metaphysics with philosophy in general. So everything more or less in philosophy is metaphysics. But then later on, he sees very specifically that some of the pre-Socratics actually had an understanding of the world and of philosophy that allowed them to get in touch with being. And he notices later on, like basically from more or less from Plato onwards, it's a bit difficult to say to what extent Socrates is guilty of this. So he kind of shares this with Nietzsche in some sense. But we see this forgetfulness of being start, and that more or less just continues all the way up until Heidegger himself. So that's like Heidegger was an arrogant man. I should just say that. And he includes Nietzsche in this, like that Nietzsche is also still part of this way of thinking. He just inverts it. So it kind of shows the extremes of it when you invert it. And by doing that, by inverting it, you're kind of saying like, well, actually this thing that was at the top for Plato, I'm just gonna put this other thing at the top. And if you do that, that could actually be dangerous because you're no longer looking at life in an unbalanced way. You still have, like, let's say, this hierarchical perspective of prioritizing a certain understanding of reality. And he more or less thinks that, well, he argues that some of the, let's say, the Nazi involvement in Germany, it seems to have been preyed upon by this negative side, this negative dimension of the will to power, where it's like, it's all about domination, and it's all about, and again, like, I understand all these arguments that say this is a misreading of Nietzsche and it's unfair because he disliked anti-Semites, and I often have to explain that to, for instance, students myself.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
nonetheless think it's like there's something interesting to be said for it, that just as you have, let's say, the negative, the dark side, the shadow aspects of the Platonic view dominating throughout time, that if you merely invert that it's not necessarily, oh, now we'll be healthy. And it is a similar thing to Jean-Paul Sartre saying, like, it's not like essence precedes existence, it's existence precedes essence. And that's also one way where Heidegger responded, like, a reversal of metaphysical statement is still a metaphysical statement. Like, you're not getting out of that. Like, you need to think radically different, like really think outside of that paradigm. So that would be, let's say, the brief
But
explanation of it.
just a clarifying question. When we talk about that reversal or inversion,
Yeah.
where in a sense that the changeable world is now on top and the forms, or what would be called the forms, are at the bottom. So there's two ways that I could take this. Is it that the real world, or the what would you say, the changeable world as it actually is now more important and the forms are less so? Or is it that the changeable world is more real and the forms are like derivatives or abstractions from that? Or is it kind of both?
I guess it would be kind of both. I guess it's more like, let's say the general point. And to be fair, like, if I want to be more nuanced, I'd have to sort of look back at the specific. But he really goes in depth on the topics such as the eternal recurrence of the same and the will to power. But it has to do with, I think, both those aspects you mentioned.
Because it seems intuitively true that idea that interpretation of Heidegger's seems intuitively true, and probably it is true, because if Nietzsche said it himself, that that's what he was doing, because he kind of does prioritize the flux of actual existence, of becoming. Um, he certainly loved Heraclitus, but it sounds like Heidegger also kind of loves the pre-Socratics as well. So I
He loves
guess,
her. Yeah.
right, yeah. So this might be not a question you can answer, but it's something that came to my head while you were talking. What's the difference then between a Heraclitean like philosophy, like original Heraclitean philosophy of flux, and a kind of inverted Platonism? Isn't that just the same thing? It seems like the objection could be that actually Nietzsche thought he was reinstituting a kind of Heraclitean philosophy rather than just inverting Platonism. What do you think?
Mm. Well, so this is interesting. Like, I think, well, because also chronologically, like, Plato came after Heraclitus.
Hmm.
There is this sense that Plato was combining, let's say, the Parmenidean insight
Hmm.
of being as being constant, and all change is illusion,
Hmm.
with the Heraclitean insight, what's like, well, no, actually change is the only thing, and all being and permanent is
Hmm.
illusion. And it's
Hmm.
like, well, actually we can apply the Heraclitean view to, let's say, the sensible world in which we live, but
Hmm.
then the Parmenidean view should then be, let's say, in this eternal unchanging structures which we call the idols, like the
Hmm.
forms or the ideas. So Plato combines the two. So therefore, I'd say if you characterize your own philosophy as an inverted Platonism, um, you're very explicit about having a response to a development that came after Heraclitus. Whereas what I think Heidegger very specifically is doing is actually saying, no, I don't want to invert Plato in order to get Heraclitus back. It's like, I just want to understand Heraclitus without understanding what was done to it, like at a later point. I mean, and obviously at some point, in some sense he does, but he wants to do so without playing by Plato's terms. And he argues that actually Nietzsche plays on Plato's terms, if that
Yeah,
makes
he
sense.
wants to escape Plato, it sounds like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
doesn't think that Nietzsche has done so sufficiently.
yeah, that's correct.
Whether anyone can escape Plato, though, is a is a different question.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. And what?
I, by the
Okay,
way, I'm also aware that slowly, like, this is like a big point that I could maybe, like, we could discuss it more, but I'm also aware that we should slowly wrap this discussion up,
yeah,
unfortunately. But it's something we could go back,
yeah,
we could discuss a little bit more in the future. Yeah.
yeah. I think that's a good amount of discussion for this episode or whatever. I think, yeah, I'll just we could have talked a little bit about opponent processes, but I think
Well,
that
I
might
think
be
we could
another
maybe,
thing. What's that?
yeah. I want to say, like, I think maybe, I know that there is a conversation with my brother planned as well, and maybe that could be part of that conversation too.
That
I'd
could
be curious to hear.
definitely work its way in there. I just
Yeah.
also wanted to comment on the ambivalent nature of will to power. Um,
Mm.
that you sort of referred to, like, is there a dark side? In a way, it seems like a very strange question to ask, because of course there's a dark side to the will to power. I don't think that Nietzsche would have been I don't think he was scandalized by the fact that there's a dark side to the will to power. It seems like it's like an instinctive reflex that I think we have as modern Western people to sort of process a philosophy through our post-Christian ethics. Like, like it's like, but this guy is not trying to do that. But then on the other hand, does his philosophy necessarily need to lead to Nazism? I would
Yeah.
think no. Um, and so I don't think there's any clear necessitation. Does it does it neglect to prohibit, condemn, or just remove the possibility of Nazism? No, of course not, because it's the will to power. And I think that's something that was kind of plugged into. Although I was recently reading that actually Hitler was more influenced by Schopenhauer, and didn't care too much for Nietzsche personally. So
Mm.
maybe maybe it was the pessimistic sort of similar philosophy, but much more
Yeah.
pessimistic that
Well, I think in general, Hitler was barely motivated by philosophical ideas. But that's a different discussion I think we could have.
Mm,
But I would want to say, like, I more or less agree with what you said, and I also think there's always this point in Nietzsche that he really complicates resentment towards another people,
mhm.
another folk, and that was really central, obviously, let's say, in the
Mm.
National
Oh,
Socialist.
absolutely. I think that
So,
Nietzsche, the man, there's no doubt about it that he would despise actual Nazis, right? I mean, his comments about anti-Semites in his time, like I don't
yeah,
think he would have anything good to say about the actual Nazis that came after him. I think he would have
yeah,
found them despicable. Um, but perhaps it's a slightly different on slightly different grounds than, let's say, a post-Christian view, right? Namely, that they're consumed by resentment, that they're pathetic, etc., etc. Um, but anyway, this has been a very interesting discussion, and really, I think it's just opened a whole lot of doors to potential future discussions and
yeah.
things to explore. So, like you said, we're going to be doing one with Lucas, your brother, very shortly. So some of these things might come back up in there. So thank you very much, Aaron, for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And again, like, I'm definitely not done talking about this. And it sounds like you aren't either, but I'm happy that hopefully at some point, like, we'll also like draw some interested viewers to this that might also have some ideas to share that would
Yes,
counterbalance some of our ideas. But
I would
yeah,
certainly
I
welcome
appreciate
that.
it very much. Yeah,
Thank you,
that's
Aaron.
good.